My name is Mark Sayak. I'm the chair of the History Department, and I want to welcome you all to our 8th annual History Undergraduate Showcase, and a special welcome to all the parents and friends of the parents and the family who are here with us today. This is a mic that is not live in the sense that it amplifies my sound. It's just being used for the recording. So if you can't hear, we can't raise the mic, but we can speak a bit more loudly. And the second thing is, when there is questions, be sure and wait until you have a mic in front of you before you ask the question so that we can record everything. The showcase has multiple purposes. It is first and foremost a celebration of the scholarly achievements of the very best of our undergraduate majors. And everyone has produced something that a faculty member considers to be of extraordinary worth, and therefore we've invited them to showcase what they have produced. And second, it's a serious occasion where we hope to provoke some thoughtful reflection and discussion and further our knowledge about a variety of topics. Bob is always making his comments. And then third, lest you think that the history world is flat and you're going to fall off when you get your BA degree, we always invite an alumni back to remind you that there is life after the BA, and sometimes a very happy life after the BA. Our student participants can be forgiven for seeing this event less as a celebration and more as a kind of nerve-wracking event where they are under scrutiny. We're not rewarding you with ribbons or plaques or a badge, and instead we're making you perform for us. So I realize it can induce stress, but, well, welcome to the world of scholarship. Now I'd like to hand things over to Kate Jones, the director of our Undergraduate Education Committee, who will introduce our speakers. Thank you, Kate.
All right, so thank you all so much for being here this afternoon, and thank you to our presenters and our speakers for being here on time and ready to go. So it's really a pleasure to be here, and I will say, as a member of the Undergraduate Education Committee, this is one of the great privileges of that position. We get to read the best papers that our history students generate, and it's really exciting to see the range of scholarship that our students generate, and it's such a wide array of topics. And I think that is what this collection of papers is going to illustrate, is exactly the breadth of kind of historical exploration that our students pursue, and also their creativity and how they contend with finding sources and in the span of 10 weeks mastering those sources enough to be able to say really interesting things about them. So I'm going to kind of leave it to them to share with you exactly how exciting that is. But I will just briefly introduce our first speaker, who is Christopher Ramirez, who is a senior history major, and the paper that he's going to be sharing some highlights with us from is a paper he developed in Matthew Lazar's class, growing out of the records of the FBI. And this has been a really has been fertile soil for a lot of our undergraduate students in their research. So Chris, if you want to come on up and speak to us about the FBI report on D.B. Cooper. Thanks.
Sit. So right here, this is D.B. Cooper. On November 24th, 1971, a man named Dan Cooper boarded Flight 305 in Portland, heading to Seattle. As the plane began to take off, he handed a stewardess a note that says, "Miss, I have a bomb and would like you to sit next to me." After she sat down, he opened his attaché case to reveal a bundle of red sticks, wires, and a 6-volt battery. After the flight flew to Seattle and landed, Northwest Oriental Airlines paid $200,000, refueled the plane, and provided 4 parachutes in exchange for 36 passengers and most of the flight crew. Cooper then gave instructions to fly to Mexico City, with very detailed instructions saying to file a takeoff plan or a flight plan in flight. The plane was to fly no higher than 10,000 feet, flaps at 15 degrees, landing gear down. After leaving at 7:40, the plane flew on a heading of 230 to Mexico City. At 8:05, the flight engineer noticed an indicator light that the aft stairs had opened, and at 8:13, the crew felt an upward bump. It is presumed that Cooper jumped at that time. So my name is Chris Ramirez, I'd like to introduce, and this is Bobby. So if he makes some noise, I do have still some anxiety about speaking in public. But I served in the Marine Corps for 11 years. I served in Afghanistan from 2004 to 2005, and I worked with aircraft. I also worked in law enforcement. That's why this appealed to me. I actually got interested in the D.B. Cooper case from a TV show called Leverage. So it was an interesting case. When I first looked at it, there was only 7 files, and it looked like a scrapbook of instead of an actual FBI file. And when I did some research into it, I found out why. Historian Athathian Harris wrote in his novel that the FBI officials had abandoned a law enforcement mission as early as 1930s, and until 1976 had no official charter and no guidance for its actions or investigations. Especially during the politically tense times of the 1970s, the FBI was directed to investigate the Students for Democratic Society, groups like the Black Panthers and the Weathermen. They were unprepared for large-scale manhunts and legal investigations. Their investigation process usually conducted of finding informants, black bag operations where they broke in, stole the information they needed, and they used this to develop counterintelligence programs. They would target these programs to specific groups as they worked. An example of this is the COINTEL program, KKK. It relied on developing KKK informants who were paid for their information. They also snitch-jacketed high-level members, which is they release information, they pick up members, they drive them along, making them look like they're an informant so they have no choice but to become an informant. The Seattle FBI office in particular, where this took place, was responsible for investigating the Students for Democratic Society at University of Washington, the May 1970 student strike, and anti-war rallies aimed at liberating soldiers that had been drafted at Fort Lewis. This case was turned over to those agents, and from the very get-go, there was turmoil between them. They couldn't agree whether or not Cooper had lived or died, and that affected the investigation. They also did not narrow down adequately the landing zone, so they relied on the Washington National Guard, local law enforcement, the Air Force, search helicopters, and planes to try to search an area in the heavily forested Cascade Mountains. The Washington National Guard, in particular, provided 549 soldiers, 8 Huey helicopters, jeeps, and trucks. And many of the soldiers on the ground were actually driven to the point of exhaustion. An SR-71 from the Air Force made 3 attempts to film the area, but because it's so dense, they were unable to produce anything. Key evidence that was recovered from the 727 was improperly handled and stored as well. In 2007, Agent James Carr had attempted to have DNA recovered from cigarette butts that had been found in an ashtray next to Cooper's seat. He found out that these cigarette butts had been lost or more likely thrown out. Some of the key scientific inquiries that needed to be made to narrow down the zone weren't actually put in place weren't done until 3 months after the crime happened. So by this time, Cooper had a huge lead. One of these tests included an Air Force test where they took a 727 and pushed 2 200-pound sleds out the back to see if they could duplicate the upward bump. The first lead in the case didn't actually occur until 1980, when an 8-year-old boy found $5,800 in bundles of used $20 bills on Tenna Bar. He was clearing an area for a fire pit and found several stacks together and turned them into the FBI. These bundles were actually found 20 miles southwest of the predicted flight path of Flight 305. Later interviews of retired FBI agents revealed that suspect pools had been ignored because of personal bias. In particular, Robert Himmelsbach believed in his personal opinion that people in the airline industry could not have been suspects because they're exceptional people. They're head and shoulders above the standards and values of the characters of normal Americans. Obvious aspects of the case were ignored, and the investigation only seemed to progress when someone brought information or evidence to the FBI's attention. Because of the culture of the FBI at the time, where it was so focused on waiting for people to bring them leads or illegally obtaining them through the black bag operations and communists, they weren't prepared for this kind of investigation. They didn't know how to do an actual law enforcement investigation, and because of that, I believe that's why Cooper has still remained uncaptured to this time.
All right, thanks, Chris. So next up, we have Stella Fronius. Stella is a senior history and anthropology double major, and this is a paper she developed in conjunction with Dustin Wright's class, and also she's continuing to do work with Alan Christie and the Gale Project. And I'll just add a note of boasting that it was just announced that her paper received a Dean's Award, so it's been recognized within the department and beyond. So we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thanks.
You'll have to excuse me. This is my first time talking in public. Thank you. In this presentation, I aim to explore the historical context for the legacy of chemical munitions within the U.S. military base complex on Okinawa. Rather than provide a full analysis of the arrival, storage, testing, and disposal of these chemicals, as I do in my paper, I will instead dedicate my time to another aspect of this essay, namely that of military propaganda and access to information of base-related hazard. There are several questions that I would like you to keep in mind as I talk, all of which are currently under debate between Okinawa, Japan, and the U.S. government. 1. What impact did these chemicals have on the lives of Okinawa? 2. Were all chemicals removed from Okinawa in 1972, as was claimed through military film? 3. Who is responsible for base-related environmental hazards? And 4. Do the people on Okinawa have a right to know if and when these hazards occur, especially if the military deems that revealing this information might endanger U.S. military security? Before I can proceed, I would like to provide you with some information that sets the context so you can understand the main part of my story. From 1945 to 1972, under the terms of the San Francisco Peace Treaty, Okinawa was considered American territory. It was American military territory. In 1961, President Kennedy officially acknowledged that Japan had residual sovereignty over Okinawa, so that someday Okinawa would become Japanese territory once again. That happened in 1972. One of the complications of the story is that the damage and the cleanup of environmental hazardous waste occurs under both American and Japanese sovereignty. While I don't have time to go into details here, I would like for you to keep in mind how complex these relationships are. If at first the bases in Okinawa were constructed for the invasion of Japan, Cold War hostilities transformed their meaning for the U.S. as a strategic location in the Pacific to halt the spread of communism. Whereas the U.S. was willing to deconstruct bases in the Philippines and mainland Japan, military leaders felt that infrastructure on Okinawa was indispensable. The United States negotiates a semi-secret document, the Status of Forces Agreement, SOFA, which tends above all else to maintain extraterritoriality from the laws and governance of the host nation so as to access as much free reign on the use of land as possible. Article 4 of the U.S.-Japanese SOFA is the limiting factor in the ability of Okinawans to react to and overcome environmental hazard. It states that the U.S. holds no responsibility for the land once they return it to Japan. There's deliberately no mention of what to do in the event of base-related environmental hazard. Okay. From early on in the occupation, Okinawans have raised complaints with the military about environmental damages coming from the bases. In response, the military consistently denied the existence of hazardous chemicals on base. My research begins with the recent declassification of occupation-era documents and the publication of muckraking reports by John Mitchell, which provide evidence to contradict the U.S. government's stubborn insistence that tactical herbicides had never been stored on Okinawa. In July 1969, a report from the Wall Street Journal revealed the existence of poisonous gas in Okinawa. Leaking drums of gas, lax safety procedures, and subsequent health issues made clear to the public the intrinsic risk of maintaining these weapons. After 3 years of deliberations, the United States Civil Administration of the Ryukyus, USCAR, relocated retrograde drums off-island. Chemical munitions were subsequently removed from Okinawa under the highly publicized Operation Red Hat. Operation Red Hat. This event is captured in a film called Operation Red Hat: Men and a Mission, which depicts a staged program designed to convince Okinawan and Japanese publics that the U.S. military were responsible stewards of their chemical stockpiles. Funded through both the Department of Defense and the Department of the Army, this documentary was used as an instrument of information control with its upbeat depiction of happy local cooperation and extensive safety procedures, as represented by the bright red hats and cute badges issued to service members assigned to the project. What is left unsaid is the history behind Okinawa's strategic role as a physical space to stockpile, survey, and deploy chemical ammunition, one that began with World War II, continued through the Korean War, and climaxed with the war in Vietnam. Testimonials from veterans and local workers paint a different and a grim picture of drums left to degrade in the sun, accidental spills occurring off the coast, and negligible oversight of safety procedures. Furthermore, as an occupied people, Okinawans who work on base were unable to work safely under either American or Japanese labor regulations, and according to interviews, Okinawan employees who handled toxic material did so without special training, without protective equipment, and without any warnings of danger. Operation Red Hat depicts none of this. We also need to think more broadly about military-related pollution in Okinawa beyond the agents that I've described to you thus far. Poisonous gas, as reported through film and newsprint, consisted primarily of only either sarin or VX nerve gas and mustard agent, as have been identified thus far. The documents I've found indicate that Okinawa was very much part of the Cold War global military initiative of manufacturing a wide variety of biological and chemical weapons under the umbrella of Project 112. Rice blast fungus, tactical herbicide, pesticide, and chloride are among the many chemicals kept on site in Okinawa for testing and storage. The military infrastructure on Okinawa is, in a word, immense, consisting of over 30 installations and 15 major bases. Map of Okinawa. The highlighted parts are the major military bases. Host to over 75% of the U.S. military presence in Japan on an island that you could fit between here and San Francisco, and is approximately the size of Santa Cruz County. As you can see on the map, these bases are distributed primarily on the Okinawan mainland, often bumping shoulders with densely populated areas. Due to living in intimate proximity, noise pollution, chemical contamination, and crime are everyday realities for most Okinawans. It's not just Okinawans that are vexed, though. An internal 1993 military report highlights the frustrations of the military as it attempts to tackle toxic contamination in the face of previous inept cleanups and bureaucratic obstacles. In the mid-1980s, during a civilian landfill project, toxins seeped from the base, resulting in death to marine life. Within these documents, personnel assigned to investigate fish kills revealed their dissatisfaction with their predecessors' attempts at properly disposing toxic chemicals. It's incidents like this, in which fire retardant spilled over from Kadena Air Base onto Okinawan land, that show a continued need for revision within the SOFA. With the aim to strengthen cooperation on environmental stewardship, the United States Secretary of Defense Ash Carter met with delegates from Japan on September 25, 2015, to come to an agreement on clarifications to Act 4 of the SOFA. This includes that Japanese officials will have information about and access to a U.S. facility after a spill, and will have access to land prior to the U.S. returning it to Japan. However, the vaguely worded clause vaguely worded clarifications did little in reducing U.S. discretionary powers, and there are no provisions requiring the U.S. to comply with these requests promptly. In spite of disagreements over the actual effectiveness of these clarifications, the symbolic importance of these discussions on responsibility, accessibility, and hazard are significant. Information relating to military activity during occupation era is only now being declassified and released to the public. To fill the paucity of current work, further research needs to be done on these types of built military environments. The impacts of militarism on the natural environment are, as the case in Okinawa shows, pervasive and long-lasting. In my opinion, what is needed is a realistic assessment of environmental impact of the U.S. bases in Okinawa and their repercussions of the biota, in the biota and among human populations. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much, Stella. So our last presenter in this panel is going to be Chris Cruickshank, who's going to be sharing his paper, Then and Back Again, A Brief History of Time. So this is a bit of a challenge, right? We're going to see how you do this in 10 minutes, which is based on a paper he wrote with Charles Hedrick. And so I will leave it there. Thanks.
It has been my experience so far in trying to talk to people about the history of time that no one really has any idea what I'm talking about. And since this is an admittedly obscure topic, I think some background and explanation is in order. This paper came about as a part of a seminar on the history of science. The class began in ancient Greece, where various philosophers were going about trying to determine what the fundamental basis of the natural world was. They were asking shockingly basic questions that proved surprisingly difficult to answer. Questions like, what is all this stuff we see around us really? What is it made out of, and why are some things different than others? And it got even harder for them when they tried to define the basic fundamentals of physics, like what motion is. And when it was roughly agreed that motion is a change in space over a period of time, it left the question as to what time itself is, really. And as I started looking for a paper topic and researching this a bit more, it turned out that just what the true nature of time is was a subject of discussion not only in ancient Greece, but also by philosophers, theologians, and scientists throughout the whole of history. And I thought this recurring appearance of time in all those fields that try to understand and explain the universe might provide another angle to survey the history of science and to explain its relationship to religion and philosophy. Because unlike other subjects at the theoretical edges of these fields, the big cosmic questions like why the universe exists and is there a God, which are no doubt important but remain remote from the course of our daily lives, time is really the fundamental framework of our entire experience of the world. this speech, for example, is being measured out in minutes. I say that I am a third-year student and that I hope to graduate sooner rather than later. Yet it is still not clear exactly what time is. As the 5th century theologian St. Augustine said, if somebody asks me what time is, I know what it is. But if someone asks me how to explain it, I don't know. And this combination, time being an undefinable abstract concept that nonetheless powerfully defines our lives, gave it particular relevance and potential as a subject for my seminar paper. My hope was that it would provide insight into the minds of the various people who attempted to deal with the nature of time, and from that reveal the terms in which they understood the world, how this changed, and what it meant for the larger history of science. And it turned out time does have something to add to this history, which really revolves around the idea of a scientific revolution where, along with the wider Enlightenment, a new modern science emerged and severed its ties to religion and antiquity. I believe Isaac Newton's idea of time can add a degree of nuance to this idea of a separation from the church, and that Aristotle's time can illustrate the real changes involved in this revolution. Firstly, the need to separate science from religion arose from the reality that through the Middle Ages, essentially all forms of learning had been incorporated into the infrastructure of the Catholic Church. And while the Church did indeed do things like imprison Galileo and burn Giordano Bruno at the stake, these were complicated affairs that were much politicized later by a variety of 19th century writing like Andrew Dixon White's History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, which propagated the narrative that the relationship between science and religion was now and forever one of irreconcilable conflict, an impression that endures in varying degrees even today. As for Isaac Newton, his discovery of gravity and formulation of classical mechanics was essentially the foundation of this new modern science, and supposedly such a triumph over theology that Dixon White himself called him one of the 5 greatest men ever. For Isaac Newton, however, the entire premise of his work in physics rested on the belief that an existence of an omnipotent God that can be everywhere and every when requires an absolute and infinite space for him to exist in. This resulted in a controversial idea of absolute motion that Newton, it was contested by his contemporary physicists, and he attempted to prove it to them with mathematics and experiments, essentially using all the tools of this newly liberated science to prove a thoroughly religious idea of space and time was physically real. This, I think, is one more among innumerable other attestations that the true relationship of science to theology is a complex one and by no means inherently antagonistic. This also reflects that during the actual course of the scientific revolution, the rhetoric of change as voiced most prominently by Francis Bacon was really directed at the tradition of Aristotelianism. And this meant that when a medieval scientist wanted to know something, like what time is, he would start by looking up what Aristotle said it was, and then he would know. But this was more than just consulting the millennia-old wisdom of Greek philosophers, as through the centuries their writings and their ideas passed through the hands of countless other scholars, going through rounds and rounds of translation, reinterpretation, were often updated and in some cases radically different than the original ideas. What Bacon and others were really breaking away from was Aristotle's methodology of observing the world in its natural state in order to find what the true purpose or causes of things are. This practice is evident in what Aristotle thought of time. He identified it simply as the measure of change and knew it was because he saw time changing everything around him, wasting things away, making them older, and unfortunately, never younger or newer. Some 2,000 years later, Sir Arthur Eddington, armed with mathematics and the scientific method, determined much the same thing, describing the invariable wasting away of things and explaining why time only ever flows forward in terms of statistics and thermodynamics. I think this captures as concisely as anything the true character of the scientific revolution as one of an evolution in methodology rather than a radical break with the past. But in terms of the grand point of all of this, of why it matters and why we should care about the history of time, in my estimation, it may have been Augustine who captured the true significance of time in saying that it is essentially all in our heads. He meant this in the sense that time only really exists in our psychological perception of it, a view that actually remains a real scientific possibility. Einstein himself said that for believing physicists, the division of time into past and future had only the meaning of an illusion, and it is still being debated today in what form time exists or whether it is even a real thing at all. But beyond it being possibly only a fabrication of our cognitive processing of reality, the creation of philosophic or scientific notions of time reflects our greater relationship to the universe, in revealing the ways people of all times and places have attempted to understand and give meaning to things that may or may not even be real, but that we nonetheless experience so profoundly. So ultimately, I think history, ideas about what time is, and the history of ideas about what time is, are really all the same story, which is the eternal endeavor of all humanity to make sense of a world often lacking it. And in that regard, I think the history of time has the potential to demonstrate how even the people of the furthest reaches of antiquity are probably more alike and nearer to us than it may appear. And that is all.
All right, thanks, Dietrich, for those great presentations. And I just will take the prerogative and the opportunity of standing here to say I was really struck in all three of these that I feel like they illustrate a couple of things I think are really valuable about historical practice and historical inquiry. And one is the ability to fashion a good story. It's no mean feat to take a 20-page paper and distill it down to 10 minutes. So I congratulate all three of you on doing that so effectively and so clearly. And that ability to make those selections about what's important is a real skill and something that is far from self-evident. But beyond that, I think all three of these papers are illustrating something about the process of peeling away our assumptions, peeling back those things we take as givens. So whether that means taking something like the medium we move through at all times, like time, and insisting that it actually has a history, or if that means recognizing the way assumptions, like the assumption that the people who work in airlines are utterly trustworthy and should never be suspected of wrongdoing, and recognizing how that kind of assumption can obscure a really useful body of knowledge. And also the persistence to be skeptical of information that's presented as whole and complete and thoroughly reliable. I think these are all qualities that made these papers stand out, but are also qualities that I think serve history majors when they go out into the world and try to help us all make sense of it. So at this point, we have time for questions for our panelists. So one just kind of caveat in thinking about this, we are recording this session, and so Stephanie Sawyer is going to be coming around with a microphone. So if you've got, once you have your question, if you can raise your hand and wait until she gets to you so we can record it, that would be great, so we can have this all for posterity. So I think we can open it up to questions from there.
Mr. Ramirez, what do you know about D.B. Cooper's background? Like where he came from, where did he grow up? You know, what did he do before this day that he's famous for? I've never heard of it.
Nothing. There is no information on who D.B. Cooper actually is, if that is his true name, if, you know, where he's from. It's suspected that he had a Midwest accent. He was heavily tanned, like he had been outside all of his life. But beyond that, there is nothing known about him. There is work with the DNA being done, little specks that are left to try to narrow down a suspect when they do find him. But beyond that, nothing.
Mr. Cruickshank, in regards to the slippages of time, which we see, which you have illustrated, came out in the medieval reconstructions of classical concepts of time. Is there a breaking point, which you came about in your research, where our modern concepts of time defined unilaterally across the European history? Or is it so slowly developing that only in the extremely modern period, say post-1750, have we defined what time is in our own self-conscious?
I'm not sure I thoroughly understand your question.
Did you find in your history,
Okay.
at some point, when everyone came to some kind of consensus about where time should be described and how it should be thought about? Because as you did alliterate on, the ancients disagreed about what time was,
Right.
all the way up through the 5th century in Augustine.
Yeah, actually, it still continues today. Even right now, the latest physicists have been trying to reconcile relativity and quantum mechanics, and apparently time has been dropping out of their equations. So some people think time isn't even a real thing, scientifically speaking, today. And there's various competing theories all throughout history today and throughout the modern period. So there has really never been a consensus.
Do you think that time is real?
I think it probably could be said to be real in the same way that space is real, but it may be only a representation of something else. And that's all.
Thanks.
Mr. Ramirez, when the youngster that was digging the fire pit found the money, did it seem to be, was it considered that it was buried or just covered with debris?
It was considered to be intermixed with the dirt. The FBI first believed it was part of a dredging operation that had dug it up. But after further examination, it had just been placed, like it had been dumped there. Not necessarily by one person, but maybe by tide currents. The Corps of Engineers did soil samples and verified that it had not been placed there as part of the dredging operation.
Okay.
For Stella Fronius, I just wanted to ask, you really kind of portrayed this as an emerging kind of topic that's, because all the evidence is kind of still being declassified, that there's a lot more room to grow in this topic. Do you think that as kind of the argument progresses, do you think that the U.S.'s presence in Japan will be put more and more into question in the future? Do you think that there's going to be a major change coming up in our future in terms of military presence abroad?
So it's a complicated question. We have actually been putting more emphasis on the Pacific in recent years because of North Korea and China. And while there's talk of moving troops from Okinawa to Guam due to issues of space and the closure of specific bases, I don't believe we're going to really desert I don't believe we're going to decrease our presence there, because our reasoning, or the military's reasoning for maintaining our presence there, is that in war, space is still an issue, and so that by maintaining those bases, we still have this protectorate presence, is the protectorate of democracy against the foreign invaders. So I don't think that these types of communications are crucial to understanding the spatial aspects of Okinawans living amidst these bases. I don't believe they're going to make any real difference in our presence on the island.
Thank you.
This question's for Ms. Fronius as well. As you probably know, the Constitution in Japan was drafted by the United States. Mm-hmm. And in recent years, there's been efforts made to amend that Constitution, especially militarily. Have you found in your research that there's any connection to the Okinawa bases, any of the things that you've brought to light? Do those affect those wants for change in the Constitution?
So Okinawa is not only U.S. forces. Since 1972, we have shared the bases, the military space there, with Japanese self-defense forces. And I don't believe that the militarism aspect will decrease on Okinawa. I think that because of want for revision within the Constitution, they're going to keep this space, but that the U.S. military presence, they'll continue to share this presence because of the resources that the U.S. can provide.
Yeah, it's a safe place for Japanese military expansion, like their Peace Corps
Yeah.
Army
Yeah.
branch or whatever that is, because they're technically not allowed to have a military, but that peacekeeping branch is all that they can
Yeah,
have. So it's
like,
a nice place where that can be entertained.
They've continued militarizing throughout this period, but it's complicated.
Well, thank you for your attempt, Dan.
You're welcome.
So thanks to our panelists for their great papers and for your great questions.